I don't shake hands with staff, Claire Bradford declared coldly, taking a pointed step back as Richard Martin extended his hand in greeting. A heavy silence fell over the Bradford Aerotech boardroom where 5 other executives sat quietly smirking in agreement. Richard held his hand out for a few more seconds, then calmly lowered it. At 42, the composed black gentleman had experienced moments like this many times before, but the glint in his eyes made one thing clear: this time would be different. I completely understand, Richard replied with a chilling calmness, adjusting the watch on his wrist, a gesture no one in the room understood for what it truly meant. Claire, CEO and heir to the Bradford Aerotech empire, looked Richard over with blatant disdain. Her expensive designer suit and perfectly styled hair stood in sharp contrast to Richard's intentionally understated outfit, a strategic choice she had completely misread. I assume you're the consultant our investors sent, she said, emphasizing the word like it was an insult. I hope you won't take up too much of our time. People like me have busy schedules. 3 hours earlier, Richard had arrived at the Bradford Aerotech lobby on time, dressed simply, driving an unassuming car, no flashy signs of who he really was. Claire and her team had no idea that Richard Martin was the head of Martin Capital Holdings, a private equity firm managing over $60 billion and currently evaluating a $4 billion investment in Bradford. The receptionist left him waiting in the lobby for 40 minutes, ignoring his polite reminders about the meeting. 2 security guards passed by him 3 times, clearly instructed to monitor him. Every small insult was quietly noted. Richard understood this wasn't a test for him, it was a test for the company. Our numbers speak for themselves, Claire continued, flipping through a stack of documents without once looking up. I don't see the need to explain complex strategies to someone who clearly won't grasp our vision. Richard gave a quiet nod, hands folded in his lap, observing every movement, every glance, every ounce of Claire's condescension, all committed to memory, and to the discreet voice recorder tucked into his jacket pocket. Any questions, Claire asked after finishing her smug, buzzword-filled presentation, glancing at her watch like every second spent on Richard was a drain on her existence. Just one, Richard replied, still perfectly composed. Do you truly believe that behavior like this reflects the values a partner company should represent? Claire burst out laughing, exchanging amused looks with the other execs, like she'd just heard the best joke of the week. Values, Mr. Martin. Our most important value is profit and performance. I trust your superiors understand that when you report back. While Claire and her team basked in their own arrogance, Richard gave a small, knowing smile as if holding on to a secret far too big for this moment. Claire resumed her presentation, all but ignoring Richard's presence, addressing the other board members directly. As you can see, our growth projections exceed industry benchmarks, she said, pointing a gold-plated laser at a chart on the screen. Excuse me, Richard interrupted calmly, but those revenue figures don't match your most recent public filing. There's a $300 million discrepancy. The air in the room shifted. Claire turned her face, twitching with restrained anger. Do you have any experience analyzing financial data at this level? More than a little, Richard replied, in the same steady tone which only irritated her more. Claire let out a sharp laugh, turning to her deputy CEO, James Hamilton. James, can you believe this? He thinks he understands our numbers better than our finance team. James, a man in his 50s with a smug expression, leaned forward. Mr. Martin, I assume your superiors sent you here with some kind of checklist? Let's make this simple. Then just tell us what you need to hear so we can wrap this up. Richard was no stranger to this kind of treatment. At 18, as an intern at a small brokerage in Chicago, he had watched black employees routinely dismissed and overlooked. By 25, during his first independent investment pitch, he had been thrown out of 3 offices before he even said a word. Every rejection, every sneer, every racially coded comment disguised beneath a professional veneer they had forged in him an unshakable will. Actually, Richard said once again, adjusting his watch, a subtle gesture he had now done 3 times, I'm more interested in your company's culture and core values. Claire burst out laughing. Our value is excellence, and we know excellence when we see it. She shot him a cutting glance, which I'm afraid I don't see in this room. A few of the executives chuckled quietly. Richard remained composed, but his phone vibrated lightly in his pocket. A message from his assistant, Marcus, ready to proceed to phase 2 upon your command. Buoyed by her team's support, Claire went in for the kill. You see, Mr. Martin companies like Bradford Aerotech operate on a level that demands refinement, proper education, the right connections, and experience in circles where the real decisions are made. I understand how that might be difficult for you to grasp. No offense, just facts. Richard gave a slow, measured nod. I understand your point, Ms. Bradford. It's fascinating how often people confuse inherited privilege with actual competence. That struck a nerve. Claire spun around, her face flushed red. How dare you insult me? My family built this company from the ground up with a $50 million startup loan from your grandfather's trust fund, Richard replied calmly. Public record. James Hamilton slammed his palm on the table. That's enough. Who do you think you are speaking to Ms. Bradford like that? For the first time since the meeting began, Richard allowed a flicker of authority to rise behind his eyes. Someone who knows the true value of everything in this room, Mr. Hamilton. Claire tried to collect herself. Fine. If it's an audit you want, let's give you one. She pressed the intercom button on the table. Jennifer, bring in the full Orison project files. Include the restricted ones. The restricted files, ma'am. Her assistant's voice crackled through the speaker. Especially the restricted ones. Our consultant seems to have ample time for detailed analysis. What Claire didn't know was that Richard had already legally accessed the Orison project files. The project was running 3 years behind schedule, was $600 million over budget, and carried clear signs of internal corruption. While they waited, Claire seized the chance to fire another shot. She turned to James and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "It's honestly astounding how some people don't realize when they're playing far beyond their league." Richard gave a quiet smile. He thought of his office just 6 blocks away, where 15 of the country's top financial analysts, Harvard, MIT, and Wharton grads, were on standby awaiting his signal. He recalled the call he took that morning from the CEO of a major bank asking for his insight on a $12 billion acquisition. Every snide comment, every superior glance in this room wasn't just etched into his memory, it was recorded on a discreet, high-grade device in his suit pocket. In just 40 minutes, Claire Bradford and her team had authored their own indictment with open discrimination and arrogance. But they didn't know that every word, every look was another brick in the wall of their downfall. Richard Martin wasn't just patient. He was a strategist. A man who understood revenge doesn't need noise, just precision. Claire approached the table, dropping the bulky file in front of him like it was some burden he'd earned. "These are all the Orison project documents you were so eager to review," she said with acid sweetness. "I imagine you might struggle to keep up with our analytical frameworks." Richard opened the file, scanning the pages at a speed that made even James Hamilton frown. In under 15 minutes, Richard had flagged 3 major bookkeeping errors, 2 probable cases of price inflation, and 1 clear violation of federal environmental compliance. The treatment in Section 7.3 is interesting, Richard remarked, pointing to a line on the page. Reclassifying operational expenses as research investment might temporarily tidy up your books, but it's guaranteed to attract attention from federal auditors. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. James and Claire exchanged a glance. For the first time, genuine concern showed on Claire's face. "How did you—" James began, then stopped when he saw Richard's calm, razor-sharp expression. "Experience," Richard replied evenly, turning another page. "I also noticed the reported productivity levels don't align with public energy consumption data from your Ohio plant. The discrepancy is around 22%. Claire felt a bead of sweat roll down her forehead. That was information only someone with internal access could possibly know. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice for the first time stripped of its usual arrogance. Richard gave her that familiar smile, the same one he had learned over years of being underestimated. "Just someone who pays attention to the details, Ms. Bradford." Right then, Claire's desk phone rang again. It was Dr. Ryan Peterson, Chief Legal Counsel of the corporation. His voice was urgent, bordering on panic. "Claire, I need to speak with you immediately. We've just received an unofficial notice from the SEC regarding a potential investigation into Project Orison. It looks like someone provided extremely detailed information about accounting irregularities." "That's impossible," Claire muttered. "Our accounting— It can't be wrong. The data is so precise," Ryan continued. "It could only have come from someone who understands our inner workings." Richard sat quietly watching the panic slowly bloom in Claire's eyes. His face didn't change calm as ever. Every dismissive comment, every discriminatory glance, every disrespectful gesture, none of it had gone unnoticed, and none of it had been wasted. All of it had bought Marcus the time he needed to complete Phase 1, because Richard Martin was not just someone who endured, he was someone who knew exactly when to strike. Claire's phone rang again. This time it was Jennifer, her assistant, her voice trembling. "Ms. Claire, the press is calling nonstop. The Wall Street Journal wants to verify allegations of racial discrimination inside the company." Discreet what Claire echoed, her voice rising sharply in disbelief. Richard remained still, eyes locked on hers. He pulled out his phone and typed a single word, "Now." 6 blocks away, Marcus Thompson received the message and smiled. Phase 2, execute. Immediately, a 43-minute audio file was distributed simultaneously to 17 financial journalists, 12 civil rights organizations, and 27 institutional investors with stakes in Bradford Aerotech. The recording captured every demeaning comment, every racially tinged remark, every insult Claire had made toward Richard during the meeting. "I don't shake hands with staff. People like me have important schedules. You wouldn't understand just reality, that's all." Her arrogant voice echoed across newsrooms nationwide. Claire still hadn't grasped the full magnitude of what was unfolding when James Hamilton burst into the room, pale-faced and breathless. "Claire, we've got a serious problem. The recording is everywhere on social media. Your remarks are being quoted and shared like wildfire." Claire spun toward Richard. For the first time, there was genuine fear in her eyes. You recorded the meeting." Richard reached into his jacket and gently placed a sleek professional-grade recorder onto the table. "I recorded every word, Ms. Bradford. Every look of disdain, every condescending remark, every moment you tried to humiliate someone you assumed was beneath you." "That's illegal," James shouted, lunging toward Richard. "Actually," Richard replied coolly, "in the state of New York, only one-party consent is required. And I gave myself permission to record myself." Claire's desk phone rang again, sharper, more insistent. This time it was Richard Blackwell, chairman of the board of Bradford Aerotech. His voice was ice cold. "Claire, you have exactly 5 minutes to explain why our company is trending nationwide with accusations of racial discrimination." Claire opened her mouth, but Richard cut in smoothly. "The $4 billion investment from Martin Capital was officially withdrawn an hour ago. Reason: grave ethical concerns." "Martin Capital," Claire echoed, stunned. "But the investor was Davidson Financial." "There is no Davidson Financial," Richard said, rising to his feet for the first time. "It was always Martin Capital, my company." The room fell dead silent. Claire stared at Richard as though seeing him for the first time. Her mind struggled to process what she was hearing. You're Richard Martin, CEO and founder of Martin Capital Holdings." Richard confirmed, placing a gold-embossed business card on the table. "Managing $62 billion in assets. Ranked by Forbes among the 50 most influential investors in the world." James Hamilton's hand trembled as he picked up the card. His eyes scanned the bold letters: Harvard Business School, former Goldman Sachs executive, advisory board member of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Richard continued, his voice steady and unwavering. "For the past 6 months, my team has been quietly assessing Bradford Aerotech as a candidate for the largest tech investment of the year. $4 billion in injection that could have made this company an industry leader." Claire collapsed into her chair. The pride that had once crushed competitors now shattered like glass beneath the weight of her own arrogance. The boardroom fell into complete silence. The air of superiority that once dominated the space was gone, replaced by disbelief, trembling uncertainty, and rising fear. Claire sat motionless, as if the blood had been drained from her body. James Hamilton silently retreated into a corner, avoiding Richard Martin's gaze like sunlight on a scorching day. Richard carefully pushed his chair back in, as though reluctant to disturb the silence further. But then he paused and turned, locking eyes with Claire, a cold edge in his stare. For the first time during the meeting, the calm in his demeanor gave way to something else: disappointment. "Do you know what the saddest part of all this is, Claire?" he asked quietly. She looked up, lips trembling. "It's not that you disrespected me," Richard continued. "I've grown used to that. As a black man, I've been treated that way since I was a scholarship kid in college, through job interviews on Wall Street, even the first time I sat at a boardroom table with white CEOs." He stepped closer to the table, his voice calm but cutting. "The saddest part is that you didn't even realize the person you were belittling was the one who could have changed the future of this company. The person you needed, yet dismissed. You chose arrogance over respect, prejudice over dialogue, and now you're paying the price. James's phone suddenly rang. He answered, nodded rapidly, then turned pale as he faced Claire. The Internal Ethics Committee is calling for an emergency meeting. They're asking you to resign voluntarily to minimize reputational damage. If you don't, the board will vote to remove you. Claire choked on her words. No, I built this company. Richard didn't show pity. He simply said calmly, "There are things you built, Claire, but there are also things you destroyed, and reputation is one of them." At that moment, the boardroom doors swung open. A tall man stepped inside, silver hair, calm yet stern eyes. Richard Blackwell, chairman of the board. "Mr. Blackwell," Claire stammered. "I can explain," Richard Blackwell raised his hand. "There's nothing to explain. Everything I needed to hear was in that recording. And I'm ashamed to say, I once trusted you." He turned to Richard Martin and extended his hand respectfully. "Mr. Martin, on behalf of the entire board, I want to apologize for what has transpired. The executive team's behavior does not reflect the values we stand for. I hope this doesn't mean you've lost all faith in a potential partnership." Richard shook his hand. "I never lose faith. I only walk away from people who don't deserve it." Then he turned back to Claire. "The resignation letter is prepared. Sign it or the board will vote." Claire looked around the room, searching for support. No one met her eyes. She knew the game was over. With a trembling hand, she picked up the pen and signed her name, one stroke of ink, and 2 decades of power dissolved into dust. Right afterward, Richard Blackwell spoke again. "We'll have our legal team reconnect with you if Martin Capital is still interested." Richard was silent for a moment before replying. "I'm still interested if Bradford Aerotech is ready for a full transformation. Not just in structure, but in culture. We're ready to listen," Blackwell responded firmly. Richard looked around the room one last time, then pulled another document from his briefcase. He placed it on the table, voice steady. "This is the internal reform plan my team and I have drafted. It includes equitable hiring practices, transparent performance evaluations, unconscious bias training, and an independent ethics council. If Bradford agrees, Martin Capital is prepared to invest but not to rescue, to rebuild." The room held its breath. Blackwell picked up the document, eyes lighting up. "You prepared this in advance." "From the very first day I walked in here," Richard nodded. "Did you know they would discriminate?" "I didn't hope for it, but I was ready." Richard gave a faint smile. "I see. Martin Capital doesn't just invest capital, it invests values." "Exactly." Just then, Marcus walked in, laptop in hand. Breaking news: CNN, Bloomberg, and the New York Times just published the recording. And on Twitter, Nashgot, Richard Martin is trending top 3 nationwide. Richard shrugged. "Not the kind of fame I was hoping for, but if it sparks a real conversation about racism in the workplace, I'll take it." He walked over and shook hands again with Richard Blackwell. "You've taught us a powerful lesson and given us a chance to make things right," Blackwell said. Richard looked him in the eye and replied sincerely, "I don't need anyone to kneel and apologize. I just want the next generation, the kids of color dreaming of stepping into rooms like this, to not have to pretend to be someone else just to be accepted." The mood in the room shifted. The tension melted away. So did the contempt. What remained was a quiet sense of respect and awakening. Claire stood up and quietly walked out. No one followed. Power isn't lost in a single decision, it fades when truth is exposed. As for Richard Martin, he stood tall, composed, resolute, proud. Not because he had won, but because today marked a step forward. Not just for him, but for everyone still waiting to be heard. 3 days later. The Grand Hilton Hotel ballroom in Manhattan was packed wall to wall. Over 20 reporters from top news outlets, CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post crowded the press area. On stage, under the spotlight, the backdrop read, "Diversity and Equity Leadership Summit 2025. The MC's voice rang out, "Please welcome our keynote speaker, founder of Martin Capital, a man reshaping finance and industry." Mr. Richard Martin. Thunderous applause echoed across the hall. Richard stepped onto the stage dressed in his signature simple gray suit, calm expression, eyes lit with purpose. "Thank you all for being here," he began, "but I'm not here to talk about myself. I'm here to talk about those who don't have this stage." The ones who never get a seat at the boardroom table, who aren't heard in strategic meetings, who are never truly seen for their talent just because of the color of their skin. He paused. The hall fell completely silent. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who got tired of staying quiet and lucky enough to have a voice. A reporter stood up and asked Mr. Martin after the Bradford incident, have more companies approached you to invest? Richard nodded. Yes, over 10 firms reached out in the past 3 days. They say they're not like Bradford and want me to audit their equity practices. But I'm not interested in policing the past, I want to build the future. Another journalist cut in. And what about the public response? That recording has been shared millions of times. Some are calling you the new black symbol of Wall Street. Richard gave a tight, bittersweet smile. I don't need a title. I need real change. The black community doesn't need another symbol. We need a system where we don't have to fight to be treated as equals. Applause erupted. But among the crowd, a young woman, brown-skinned, wearing a tech trainee uniform, shyly raised her hand. Mr. Richard, she said softly, I'm a second-year aerospace engineering student. I cried when I saw your video exposing Bradford. I almost dropped out because one of my professors told me a black girl doesn't belong in this field. But today, I'm here because you showed me I could be. Richard stepped off the stage, walked toward her, and extended his hand. Thank you. And if you ever need a mentor or an internship, Martin Capital will welcome you. The applause that followed wasn't just loud, it was filled with belief. Meanwhile, at Bradford Aerotech headquarters, the board had just concluded a 4-hour emergency meeting. Chairman Richard Blackwell sat still, staring at a financial report marked bright red. Bradford shares had dropped 11% in just 72 hours. But instead of looking discouraged, he turned to the newly appointed CEO, a black woman named Monique Daniels. She had previously been vice president of engineering, but had never been invited to the executive table until now. Ms. Monique, Richard said, I believe a new era for Bradford begins here with fairness, transparency, and real competence. Monique nodded. I'll give it my all, not to get back at anyone, but to prove that skill has no color. He nodded back. And starting next week, the restructuring plan proposed by Richard Martin will be officially implemented. 1 week later. Inside the sleek glass-walled office of Martin Capital, surrounded by greenery and a calm hush, Richard sat at his desk when Marcus walked in holding a report. You'll want to see this, Marcus said, handing it over. Market report? Richard raised an eyebrow. No, it's the scholarship data from the Next Chair initiative, the program you launched last week. Richard scanned the page 487 applications from black students in engineering, aerospace, and business management. 32 small businesses expressing interest in joining Martin Capital's Talent Development Fund. 5 universities inviting Richard to speak at their freshman orientation week for students of color. He set the report down, leaned back in his chair, and looked out the window. Sometimes, Richard said quietly, a confrontation in a boardroom opens a door for thousands of others. Marcus nodded, his pride unmistakable. You didn't just change Bradford, Richard. You're changing the system. Richard said nothing. But as he turned back to his desk, he opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo, he and his mother standing outside a worn-down apartment building in Harlem. On the back of the photo, in his mother's handwriting, were the words, You don't have to be like anyone else. Just do what's right, especially when no one else will. He stared at the words for a long moment, then gently placed the photo back in the drawer. There were still battles ahead. But today he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't fighting alone anymore. 3 weeks later, Harlem, New York. 148th Street was still dusty and noisy, just like in Richard Martin's childhood memories. But now, beside the small convenience store where he used to buy instant noodles, a new sign gleamed under the summer sun, the Martin Academy, Leadership and Finance Training Center for Black Youth. Richard stood silently before the sign. He wore a plain shirt, no tie, no security, just a son coming home. A voice called out behind him, Look at Cynthia's boy now, all grown and doing big things. Richard turned around to see Mrs. Gloria, the neighbor who used to watch him when his mom worked night shifts at the hospital. She pulled him into a warm hug. You still live here, ma'am? He asked, smiling. Of course I do, so I can see kids like you come back and do what this whole neighborhood dreamed of. Richard was genuinely moved. Sometimes success isn't measured by billion-dollar deals or fancy keynote speeches. It's in the pride of those who saw you start from nothing. Inside the Martin Academy's main classroom, over 40 black teens sat around long tables, eyes filled with curiosity. Among them was Sierra, 17, expelled for being too difficult, Malik, 14, who'd grown up in the foster system, and many others carrying dreams that had never had a place to land. Richard stepped in, laid a folder on the desk, and looked around the room. "Do you know why I came back?" he asked. A boy raised his hand. "Because you're famous now and want to help us." The room burst into laughter. Richard chuckled too, then shook his head. "I came back because you are the future. And if I don't do this, then who's going to give you a seat at the table? A voice to speak up, a door to walk through." He continued. "My mom was a nurse who raised me on her own. One time when I said I wanted to study finance, a teacher told me, 'Be realistic, people like you don't get that high up.'" The classroom fell silent. "But today," Richard continued, "I didn't just make it to the top floor, I built an elevator, so I could bring as many of you up with me as possible." A wave of applause erupted and didn't stop for a while. At the end of the session, a young girl with curly hair and sharp eyes, Zoe, approached Richard hesitantly. "Mr. Richard, I have this idea for an app to teach finance to high school students, but I don't know where to start." Richard nodded gently. "Do you have a pen and paper?" She nodded. "Then that's where we'll start. With that, and with belief." That night, Mount Morris Cemetery. Richard stood in front of a modest headstone. Carved into the stone were the words Cynthia Martin, a mother, a dreamer, a believer. He placed a bouquet of white flowers at its base, then sat beside it. "Mom," he whispered, "I did it. But I know this is only the beginning." A breeze passed softly as if someone were listening. "I've forgiven the people who once looked down on me, not because they deserve it, but because I don't live in the past anymore. I live for the future, for Zoe, for Sierra, for all the kids no one's named yet." He stood, eyes lifting toward the starry night sky. "And I'll keep going because this isn't a story about victory. It's a story about continuation." 1 month later, Wall Street. A massive digital billboard hung between two towering financial buildings. On it, Richard Martin standing proudly among a group of students holding a book in one hand, a confident smile on his face. Beneath the image, bold white text read, "Sometimes the one who changes the system isn't the one chosen. It's the one who walks in anyway, carrying an entire generation behind him."